promised. In country after country, they have had a depressive impact. They worsen the economic crisis that they are supposed to solve. Thus, justifying them in spite of their manifest failure requires turning the economic debate into a moral drama. Perhaps, we are told, perhaps austerity policies do not function as well as expected, but they are morally deserved. Austerity is the deserved, if bitter, consequence of our irresponsibility. William Davis thus speaks of a third stage of neoliberalism, which he calls punitive neoliberalism, which is characterized by the justification of austerity policies as punishment, a deserved punishment of past excesses that must be administered regardless of other considerations. It's not so much now that these policies are efficient, even they are even willing to admit that they are not as efficient as they are supposed to be. But nevertheless, we must impose them, because otherwise the whole moral order of our society would collapse. From this punitive perspective, to protest against austerity, as many of us insist on doing, seems particularly perverse. Such protests perpetuate, according to this perspective, they perpetuate the very same irresponsible behavior that lies at the root of the crisis, affirming the infantile desire to live whichever way without facing the consequences. Furthermore, if the fiscal and debt crisis is the result of the irresponsible actions of government or politicians, or both, then it must be concluded that both the electorate and the representatives are part of the problem. They can hardly be expected to lead in the solution if left without proper guidance. Hence, an authority above the electoral pressures is needed to impose the required discipline. Thus, from its inception, neoliberalism demands a reduced democratic accountability as it shifts key policy decisions to unelected bodies. For example, shifting important policy decisions to central banks that nobody elects, and they act independently of who is in government at any particular moment. And this is often done and justified in the name of depoliticizing decisions, of creating non-party or non-partisan or technocratic institutions, or placing decisions in the hands of professionals or so-called experts. Now, everything I have said applies to Puerto Rico in a very clear way. None of this refers to Puerto Rico in particular. This is neoliberalism in general. But all of this applies very clearly to Puerto Rico. I already referred to the widespread notion of chronic unemployment as a result of the purported laziness and of the demoralizing impact of welfare. Regarding debt, it's no different. Public debt, we are told, is the consequence of fiscal excess, government overspending, or government over-expansion. The phrase normally used in Puerto Rico is gigantismo gubernamental. We have a gigantic government. Individually and collectively, we have lived beyond our means. But the unavoidable day of reckoning, we are told, is upon us. And this is the logic that is to be found in editorials, opinion columns, radio and TV programs, policy papers, and interventions in public hearings, and so on. Phrases such as "the party is over," because we had a big party and now the party is over. The mirage that we tried to inhabit has now dissolved. The false glitz covering our misery has dissolved, and so on. Readjustment would be painful, but it's deserved. To protest is unrealistic, irresponsible, and infantile. Davis and other researchers have also studied what they call financial melancholia. It's an interesting concept, which briefly put is something that they describe as afflicting persons, individuals, that internalize the guilt for their situation of over-indebtedness, who blame themselves for it in spite of evidence that speaks to the contrary, and who feel that they deserve punishment for this debt that they have incurred. And needless to say, this is the mindset that best corresponds to an attitude of acceptance towards the policies of austerity, typical of punitive neoliberalism. And this is the mentality, this is the idea, again, that is incessantly promoted by editorialists, columnists, commentators, and analysts in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, this comes with an additional twist. As mentioned above, Puerto Rico is usually portrayed as isolated from the global crisis. It is as if Puerto Rico were the only place undergoing a fiscal and debt crisis. What allegedly we face is not a particular case of a global crisis, but a strictly Puerto Rican disaster, rooted in the incapacity of Puerto Ricans to adequately manage their own affairs. This specifically Puerto Rican pathology that lies at the root of the crisis justifies or would justify that an external agent, such as the Federal Fiscal Control Board, be put in charge of rectifying Puerto Rico's financial practices. In our case, then, the general neoliberal explanation of the debt crisis as the result of personal or public responsibility and of austerity enforced by non-elected, undemocratic bodies as the necessary corrective, both draws upon and reaffirms the colonial notions of native, in this case Puerto Rican, inadequacy for self-government that long predated the crisis. This is not new, but this is reaffirmed by the crisis, and also is the solution of the crisis through anti-democratic means is nurtured by it. But we know, as I said before, that austerity policies have an unjust and counterproductive impact. Just to give one fact, economist Sergio Marx, who is not a particularly radical or leftist analyst, calculated that the budget cuts adopted by Governor Rosselló in collaboration with the Federal Control Board will depress Puerto Rico's GNP by at least 6.5%. This is the least depression. It could be much higher. Now, my final section, resistance to all of this. The struggle against punitive neoliberalism and its ideology begins with the rejection of its myth. 1. Unemployment is not the result of laziness, but an aspect of capitalism, and even more so of colonial and dependent capitalism. 2. Debt and over-indebtedness are not caused by personal irresponsibility or over-generous public spending. They are inherent to capitalism, particularly in its most recent period, with its anti-labor policies, corporate tax cuts, and bailouts. 3. People and states owe capital because capital owes all of society. In Puerto Rico, this manifests itself in a particular paradox, which is a stagnant economy with a bankrupt government still generates massive profits for a handful of mainly US corporations. 4, the fiscal and debt crisis is not a Puerto Rican particularity, but part of a much global process. 5, austerity is not inevitable. It is the policy that global capital seeks to impose to make us pay for its crisis. 6, to the extent to which it is imposed, austerity is imposed, is not preordained, but rather depends on the outcome of the clash or the series of clashes between its promoters and the resistance to it. In Puerto Rico, the prevailing orthodoxy repeats over and over that since austerity and neoliberal policies have been adopted globally, we cannot do otherwise. This discourse is deployed everywhere. Everybody, everywhere is told that since such policies are dominant elsewhere, they must be adopted everywhere. To break the chain of global neoliberalism, ultimately an international task, we need 2 things. First, nobody, anywhere, no people can afford or should wait for others to resist or struggle. If we all wait for others to act elsewhere, then nobody will act anywhere. If we all wait for a more favorable international situation, then the international situation will remain unfavorable. We must act wherever we are, even when initially isolated, if such is the case. Second, we must understand that nobody, no people, can succeed on their own. We cannot wait for anybody to initiate the struggle, yes, but we must count on others and must immediately seek to link our struggle with resistance elsewhere, beginning in our case with the struggles in the United States. Puerto Rico today urgently needs, 1, a program of economic reconstruction, 2, the political powers necessary to carry out that program, 3, a movement capable of formulating and pressuring for that plan and of demanding and attaining those powers, and 4, international allies without which no alternative to the dictates of capital can succeed. In other texts, I have summarized some of the key aspects of Puerto Rican society under U.S. rule. Allow me to restate 6 of them very rapidly. First, since 1900, Puerto Rico's economy has been shaped by the priorities and preferences of U.S. capital. It has been and remains a classically dependent colonial economy. Secondly, while specializing in the production for export largely controlled by U.S. capital, the island has imported most of the consumer goods needed for its reproduction. An example of this one-sidedness is the destruction of Puerto Rico's agriculture. Third, a further consequence of the domination of U.S. capital has been the outflow of a significant portion of the income generated in Puerto Rico. Presently, around $35 billion live every year in the form of payments to external investors. Needless to say, this is capital that is not reinvested in Puerto Rico, which leads to a 4th feature of the economy since 1900. Puerto Rico's dependent economy has never been able to provide sufficient employment for its workforce. At present, Puerto Rico has a 40% labor participation rate. The official unemployment rate is 12%. 5, given the lack of employment, considerable migration has been another aspect of Puerto Rican life since the early 20th century. High unemployment also conspires against higher wages, which deepens economic inequality and ensures high levels of poverty. This helps explain the 6th feature, which is the persistence of the wide gap in living standards between Puerto Rico and the United States mainland. Puerto Rico's per capita income is the 3rd of the U.S. figure. It's half of the per capita income in the poorest state. Around 45% of the people in Puerto Rico live under the U.S. poverty level. Whatever material progress Puerto Rico has made over the last century, and that progress is undeniable, must be tempered by acknowledgement of these limitations and contradictions. And I wish to underline what I'm going to say now. All of these limitations and contradictions are not the result of restrictions or movement of capital or goods between Puerto Rico and the United States. They are, if anything, the result of free trade, of the unfettered movement of capital, not of restrictions to it. In other words, the dogmas of free trade are part of the problem and not the solution. We need a planned reconstruction of our economy with broadened public and cooperative sectors. Unfortunately, nothing could be further from the proposals emanating at present from the Puerto Rico government, the Federal Fiscal Control Board, or Congress for that matter. To orient our resistance to their punitive neoliberal agenda, we have presented a program that in general terms includes 1, audit annul the illegitimate portion and renegotiate the remainder of the debt with 3 priorities: protecting pensions, essential public services, and retaining resources required for economic renewal. 2, adopting an economic reconstruction plan centered on reinvesting profits generated in the island that must include a reconsideration of the existing tax exemption policies. 3, democratically reforming the public sector with active labor participation and citizen participation. 4, self-initiating a process of decolonization and self-determination through a constitutional status convention. And 5, obtaining a sizable sizable funding from Congress for Puerto Rico's economic reconstruction, as well as action for Puerto Rico's decolonization. Are these goals attainable? Yes, but only through consistent and growing mobilization on the island and of our allies in the U.S. mainland. Is it possible to find such allies beyond Puerto Rico? Yes, however, only, I believe, to the extent that the alliance is based not only on sympathy for Puerto Rico, which is important, but is not sufficient, not only based on sympathy for Puerto Rico, but also on a shared agenda of resistance against policies that affect working and poor people in the United States as well. Working and poor people in the United States today face the impact of several decades of neoliberal corporate tax, fiscal, social, and economic policies. As much as we in Puerto Rico, they need a vast program of economic reconstruction geared towards the creation of jobs and the satisfaction of basic social needs. We in Puerto Rico must connect with all movements pointing in that direction. The fact that these movements are still minority forces both in the United States and Puerto Rico makes it all the more urgent that those seeking to build them join forces and collaborate as effectively as possible. Thank you.
Questions from the floor addressing either Maria de Lourdes or Rafael? Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Jesus Alvelo. I'm a former PhD student here at UMass, microbiologist, pro-independence movement. My question is, today, Jeff Sessions, the Secretary of Justice, included the Estado Libre Asociado in the plebiscite. There's a lot of uproar right now in the island, and my question is that right now, there's a good, thank you. Right now, I think there's a good ground in order to push forward independence. My question is, what type of strategies in terms of communications could you guys use in order to use the independence or educate people of the benefits of independence? I was the former scientific advisor for a previous governor candidate, David Bernier. And one thing that I learned in this past election was that there was a lack of use of social media from a lot of candidates. And I believe that it's a very strong method to educate people, very accessible. And I just want to hear from you guys, what will be your strategies to use social media to educate people about the benefits of independence? Thank you.
Rafael.
Well, going beyond the question of the plebiscite that we have right now, I think that if we want to build a movement for independence and for social transformation in Puerto Rico, I think the first thing we have to build is the confidence of people that they can change things. One of the things that I found, this is changing now, fortunately,
I agree.
but in the beginning, when the board, the Junta was organized and so on, you would be surprised, and not pleasantly, of the many people who supported the creation of the Junta.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to ask yourself, why do they support the creation of this Junta, at least initially? And my perspective was that they did so as a concept, a combination of two things. One of them is a very healthy one, which I also share, which is they are very upset at the government of Puerto Rico. They consider the government of Puerto Rico and the ruling parties have completely mismanaged the government, the island, and the economy for many years. They think that they are a bunch of corrupt officials, which is correct, and they think that Puerto Rico needs a very profound and radical change.
Yeah.
But this notion, which is very healthy, is combined with a very heavy notion of impotence. We need change, but we cannot do it. We cannot transform things. So therefore, if you need change and you cannot do it, then somebody else has to do it. And, the junta or whoever has, an angel from heaven has to come down and fix things because you cannot do it. So if you want to build a movement for independence and for social transformation, we have to start building that confidence in people that they can actually bring about the change that they want. And you do that not from one day to the next. You do that by mobilization, by activism, and so on. That's why I think that things such as the struggle in the University of Puerto Rico are very important, because they build that capacity for change. My friend Emilio was asking in the previous panel, what is the outcome of these struggles? My answer would be, we don't know yet, because the struggle is still going on. It's all of these are small battles leading in one direction. The final thing that I say, because probably Maria Luz wants to say something about this too, is that we are building from a very difficult situation in Puerto Rico. Perhaps because of my socialist and Marxist affiliations. For me, for example, the situation of the labor movement is very important. The situation of the working class is still very important. What we have lived in Puerto Rico in the last 20 years is the destruction of a considerable part of the working class. We have one half of the manufacturing employment we had 20 years ago. Literally, the working class was swept away. It's not there anymore. And many people do not have the experience of working with other people in relatively large collective enterprises. So the notion that you can organize collectively to change things is not there. And the labor movement, which remains, it still exists, it's still important, is much weakened. So the notion that we can change things is something that we have to build. And fortunately, I think that resistance to the junta, resistance to the things that the junta is doing, are pointing in that direction. And in February 9, we have a very significant march in San Juan. Many people, there are probably about 10,000 people in that activity. Then we had a very big, surprisingly large activity on March 8th on International Women's Day, which was in the Villa de Oro, the place where all the big banks are located. And after that, we've had other very important mobilizations that indicate that after a period of relative demobilization, people are again, willing to consider other actions, besides all the other more local initiatives that are going on. So I think we have to build from there.
Thank you.
First, Jeff Sessions cannot change the ballot. His approval was needed in order to make use of the $2.5 million the Obama administration had assigned for the education campaign.
Yes.
For the plebiscite. So now it's up to the governor and the legislature to change the terms of the plebiscite. I hope they will resist. Politically, that's the only way.
I agree. That's how it should be.
And I expect this to make people really mad at the United States. Because this kind of intervention, particularly after in 2012, people rejected the territorial status. It's completely inappropriate. You were asking how can we evolve in the independence movement? Well, that's the question we've been trying.
How can you, Dr. Bernabe explained very beautifully how people are able to organize, but in terms of somebody that I'm young, I'm 31 years old. In Puerto Rico, there's a lot of people that they stick to radio. Radio is very conservative. However, the social media has a lot of influence. And during this
You're on Facebook Live right now.
Yeah. So I understand. However, things in social media are more complicated. On Facebook Live, Periscope, you need a whole movement in the social media and in the streets, and I completely understand.
And we can agree on that, but there's something, last night we were talking about this. A couple of days ago, Joseph Stiglitz,
yes,
Nobel Prize, he addressed a very large audience, 1,000 people. And he said that the draconian measures imposed by the Fiscal Control Board will hurt the economy, would target the most vulnerable people, and that made the headlines. We weren't that successful, saying the same things.
Yeah.
Some things, let's put it, must be said in English.
I agree.
because people need to hear from the United States, from people here in the that's why we insist that in order to make acceptable to most people the idea of independence or free association, we need action from Congress. But nothing will happen in Congress if we don't act before, and that's for us. It's what the plebiscite is about.
Yes.
It's our way of saying, hey, this has to stop. We want to change our relation with the United States.
Thank you.
The gentleman in the last row.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Victor Davila. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, Bayamón, Puerto Rico. Gracias. Good evening, everybody. My name is Victor Davila. I'm originally from Bayamón, Puerto Rico. And first of all, thank you to all the panelists for the wonderful presentation. I have to admit to you, when I first saw the news, read the news on the internet, on my Facebook, I was scandalized. I was totally scandalized. I was angry. It appears to me, I've been trying to come up with a way to sweeten the question, but I'm going to ask you straight out. It appears to me that somebody's playing with fire by including ELA, by trying to put ELA back on the ballot. It appears to me that the United States is really, really undermining the anger of Puerto Rican people. I often tell people that if being a colony is so good, then why did the United States break away from England? That's one of the arguments I should say. If being a colony is so good, why did the US break away from England? And so my question is, now at this junction, do you see CELAC stepping up in our defense, advocating for us to continue to move forward into a plebiscite as it is stated now? And do you see this as the second stop of neoliberalism? Recently in Ecuador, the left won the presidency, and they stopped that neoliberalism trend. Do you see that, if Governor José sees that, do you see that might be the beginning of something in Puerto Rico where we can stop neoliberalism on its track?
Excuse me, you said that Lasso won in Ecuador?
The left won in Ecuador from Lenin Moreno. Left, yeah. They actually made history. It was the first time in history that they elected somebody who is paraplegic.
We are going to allow, of course, Maria de Lourdes and Rafael Bernabe to answer the question, but the organizers, the other Junta of Fiscal Control that we have here, are telling me that we need to stop in order to go to the Thompson in order to eat. So please note that this is just the beginning, and tomorrow we are going to continue with 3 more panels, and we will continue the conversation and the deliberation. And hopefully we are going to have the funds to carry out and keep continuity to this type of deliberation in the future.
We are going to Thompson 620. There is Puerto Rican food there waiting for us.
See, very rapidly, it's very terrible to be between you and dinner, and so I'm very bad position to be in, so I will speak very briefly. Addressing your question, I think that what just happened with Jeff's, perhaps some people are wondering what is all this discussion about Jeff Sessions and so on. There's going to be a plebiscite in Puerto Rico in June. We can debate whether it's going to solve anything or not, but it's going to be a plebiscite. And the plebiscite has 2 options in it right now. The ballot has 2 options: statehood and another option, also have a name, which includes 2 options: independence and free association with the United States. So you can vote for one or the other 2. If the other 2 win, then there's going to be another plebiscite to decide between those 2. The present status, the ELA status, the Commonwealth status, is not in the ballot, and therefore the defenders of it were struggling, to have it included. It so happens that there is a previous federal legislation which says that they will provide $2 million, is it? $2.5 million for the government of Puerto Rico to carry out a plebiscite that includes constitutional options within it. So the Secretary of Justice of the U.S. has to decide whether this plebiscite is valid or not in that sense. So he just issued an opinion that he thinks that the present status should be included as a third option. And this is what the debate is all about. Now, whether they include it or not, I don't think, my personal perspective, and whether you tactically decide to vote in it or not, it's another issue altogether again. I think we should vote in the plebiscite, and I think we should vote for independence. But I personally don't think it's going to solve much, whether they include it or not. It's just like the one in 2012 didn't solve much. And that underlies the importance of point 4 in my presentation about our brief immediate program, which is that we have to self-initiate a process of decolonization. We should organize a Puerto Rican Constitutional Convention, or whichever convention we want to organize, to start a process of self-determination. Not wait for Congress to do this. Confront Congress with our action in that direction. The other point I want to make very briefly, and it's basically posing a problem, not giving an answer, is that, and I include myself in this because I'm a defender of independence, sometimes I hear us who are in favor of independence of Puerto Rico speaking, and we are so sure of the rightness of this option and this perspective, which I think we should be, because I think it's the correct path for Puerto Rico, that we forget that at present, the vast majority of the people in Puerto Rico do not support independence. So our first question has to be, beyond affirming our belief in this notion, is how do we get them from where they are now to the position where we want them to be. And I insist that this is not going to happen from one day to the next. And there are going to be many avenues in that direction. I think the Independence Party plays a fundamental role because it affirms, as Maria de Lourdes did so very eloquently a few minutes ago, the need for independence. The party to which I belong has a sort of, at least I have a different take within that party, which is that we want to bring people out of the traditional parties. We want to bring them to an anti-neoliberal agenda, We want to bring them to a struggle against the junta, but not necessarily defining our struggle initially as a struggle for independence. In our party, there are people who are for statehood. We had candidates who are stateholders, but they are against neoliberalism, and they are against Promesa, they are against Donald Trump. So they want Puerto Rico to be part of the United States, but they don't want these policies that are dominant in the United States. And we think at this moment it's important to try to work with these people. Even if I am an independentista socialist. Somebody is most of the people who are in the Working People's Party in Puerto Rico who are stakeholders, as you would suspect, were supporters or sympathized with the Sanders campaign. But the point is that we are trying to create movements in which people who do not necessarily identify as independentistas are also welcome, because they are equally worried about pensions and employment and the crisis of the debt and austerity policies and so on.
And maybe eventually they'll see that having
Absolutely.
we can
They will see that we are not monsters that,
Real quickly, I wanted to make a quick point.
We're having Maria Lourdes, and tomorrow we're gonna gather again.
Very briefly. No electoral event will change reality by itself. It's going to be a very long process, but it's a very important point to start with.
Can I say really quickly though, that part of the problem is that Americans are controlling the narrative of what's happening with these plebiscites. You had mentioned that 54% rejected, right? Statehood or the territory.
No, territorial.
The territorial.
Territorial.
However, Americans here, and if you read up on the literature, the most current literature, they have translated that to mean that Puerto Ricans are rejecting independence and are in favor of statehood. And that has been the narrative here in the United States, and I fight that narrative all the time as far as education. So as long as our Americans in diaspora are perpetuating that idea, that's going to be the continual problem and one of the major obstacles to the road to independence.
We are short on time to explain that, but there were two questions in the 2012 ballots, and that's what provoked this. As to the previous question, colonialism and neoliberalism are so closely, how's the word, intertwined? Intertwined. Nothing is going to change in the economic system unless we change our political situation, because the United States rules. That's it. What we want, and I think previously one of the other panels, the issue was addressed. We want to change Puerto Rico because, hey, it's a moral imperative. We must rule in our country. It's just wrong to be ruled by a foreign country. But we also want to change the economic reality. We want to change the relations of power. But that is not going to happen under the current status. That's not going to happen under statehood. And reality is the best proof of it.
Thank you. Panel, we will continue tomorrow.